G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today we're talking one-page rules. So, one-page rules, they came and approached me and said, would you like to do a review of some of our products? We've noticed you do a bit of 3D printing. And I said, yes, I would love to do that. I think it's great that people are creating their own files and doing their own hobby and helping to support things that used to be supported by other companies perhaps and aren't anymore. So today, this video in particular is going to focus on the actual miniatures and talk about how we would acquire them, how we would print them, etc, etc. So here is their page over on My Mini Factory. So this is where I got my miniatures off them through, and where you can go and get some yourself if you're interested. So as you can see, there are prices attached to them. They're not free. Now, how far does your money go? Well, this is the big question. So, things like the Duchies of Venezia, $109. But look how many miniatures you get in it. And if you buy them once, you can print them as many times as you like. There is no limit on it. You now own those files. Skull Catapult, $15. What if you have a Tomb King's army and you're missing a Screaming Skull Catapult and you want something that's roughly analogous to that? You could come here, spend $15 and get one. Hell, you could get two. Just print an extra one for yourself. Nothing stopping you. And they obviously have a wide variety of stuff here. There is space fleets. There are fantasy steampunk miniatures. There are also 40k style miniatures or science fiction style miniatures, very similar to, say, the Necrons or the Tyranids. There's stuff that is similar to the Tomb Kings and the Lizardmen. Now, they're not exactly replicas of it. It's not like you could pick them up, walk into a games workshop, put them down on the table and just play. But for most game systems, something like Kings of War, I don't think anyone would argue with these using these miniatures. And if you're playing in your own community, who's going to say that the Skeleton Guard, for example, on screen right now, they're not, say, Tomb Guard for the Tomb Kings? So speaking of these miniatures, we can actually click on them. And what you could do is you could come in and you could click Add Files to Cart to purchase them. And you could do this and pick as many as you want from the range. Now, as you go through the pictures that are below, you get a pretty good idea of what actually comes in the STL files. Now, many of these miniatures actually come with the options for printing as a single piece, printing as multiple parts, so say the arm might be separate to the rest of the body, or you even have pre-supported miniatures where the models will come, basically all the settings are in there ready to print, you just click and drag them over. I'm going to show you later on in this video how to print them as a single piece, which I don't really recommend because it's a lot harder, but you can do it. How to print them as a single piece and put in your own supports and what you need to look out for, because I think that's the route that most people tend to head down. But do keep in mind they will come with a variety of options available to you. Now, speaking to the quality, you'll see the actual STLs later, up close and personal, but I can assure you these are gorgeous quality miniatures. Now, they're not without their flaws, and you'll see that on one particular miniature that I'll talk about in the showcase, which is a larger model too, one of the parts is what I would call exceedingly brittle, and it needs to be better strengthened later on down the track, but it is not a major problem. Sometimes what happens when you create models digitally is you can't be sure of just how strong a part is going to be, and something that may even be thicker than it is on other miniatures is suddenly very weak on this particular one because it is being stressed by the other stuff around it, and I think that's what happened in the case of that particular miniature. And again, I'll point it out when the time comes. But yeah, you can go through, you can pick the miniatures that you want. You're not forced into picking a whole range or buying an expensive bundle, like a $100 bundle. Maybe you just want this Vinci Alchemist. And you just like this one guy. $5. And you could print this guy at home. So nothing stopping you from doing that, is there? And there's even a little painted version of him right there. How cool is that? So, are these models up to scratch or on par with other miniature manufacturers? As in some of the big boys in town, maybe Mantic and Kings of War, or Games Workshop and Warhammer 40,000. Yes and no. They definitely have as much detail and can be as dynamic. This is true. But there's always a slight disconnect because there are certain styles that are just intrinsic to certain brands and are very hard to replicate. And if you do replicate those styles perfectly, then you start to be stepping on the toes of that other brand. That said, I've immensely enjoyed printing some of these files out. And not only did I print them out, because that's the easy part to show you guys, I actually went the step further and painted several of these miniatures and partially painted several of them to give you an idea of the steps along the way, what to look for, and the quality of the detail before and after the paint process, so you can have the best idea of what you're getting yourself into if you choose to go down this route. Now, One Page Rules also has their own points system and game system that's available. I will talk about that at a later stage. So right now, let's go look at some miniatures, and then after we look at some miniatures, we'll go back and we'll look at actually utilizing some of those files. Now, the last thing to note before we do that, if you do decide to purchase some of these files, you only need an account with My Mini Factory. They're pretty good. I've never had any issues with them. No one's hacked my credit card or anything like that, so that's great. Also, the developers, they have their own Discord. They're very approachable, so feel free to hit them up if you're curious or join their online community. I'll gladly give them a shout out and look for a link in the description of the video below. Do keep in mind though, it's Discord. Those links do expire after time. Now, these files, once you own them, it's simply a case of going into the files that you own and just hitting download. It's really that easy. And once it's on your computer, well, you'll see what happens from there. So here you can see a collection of the miniatures. This one here is obviously not from One Page Rules. This is actually a Saurus Temple Guard from Games Workshop in white metal versus the One Page Rules miniature. This one I painted myself, and as you can see, is exquisitely detailed. This was printed in the Hell at One printer, and I'm really happy with it overall. The model came out pretty much perfectly. There are a few things that are weak about the miniature, but I think in comparison, when I'm not dropping them, it really is an excellent rendition of something similar to what Citadel has done, but different at the same time. A lot more dynamic, less chunky than the old white metals or fine cast miniatures that you find in the range. We also have the Skink Priest here. This one, I've simply done a base coat with the airbrush, and then I've just washed over it in order to get that sort of two-tone scheme, so you can get an idea of the detail of the miniature. Here we have a miniature which you could say is roughly analogous to a Ravener for the Tyranids. I did it in the coconut crab scheme because I wanted to try it out, and I think it's a pretty cool colour scheme. As you can see, the miniature is, well, it's a damn excellent miniature, and this was printed as a single piece, not as multiple parts, although the files they give you do grant you the option of that, as you'll see. But very cool miniature nonetheless. Here we have something that could be used to represent the Ushabti, and as you'll see, they've been printed in two different scales. So one of the scales offered, as you can see here, is roughly the size of the other human-sized creatures, the 28mm scale. There is actually a 35mm scale available, I believe it is, which, as you can see, is pretty damn nice. They're relatively well-made miniatures, well-designed miniatures. However, there is one obvious weak spot, and you'll see where my finger is pointing. The blade actually snapped through that point. It is very thin, and just hitting that blade at the wrong angle with your hand by accident can cause it to snap off due to the brittle nature of the resin. And I think that if we're talking about these miniatures being used on the tabletop, durability is something you have to keep in the back of our minds, and that might be something you want to do, is increase the durability of that part by maybe changing the base file slightly to make it a little bit more solid. And this miniature was painted with just 4 colours: gold, blue, grey and a wash, which I thought you might find interesting. Then we have the Royals over here. Now, the Tomb Priest is a very excellent model, well detailed. But due to the nature of the cloak and how I actually had done my supports, you can see I misprinted the bottom edge of the cloak. However, I think once it's painted, you won't really notice that the mistake in the file is not One Page Rules' fault, it's actually mine with the printing. Speaking of faults, we also have one over on the Tomb King, but of course I'll show the Tomb King off because I think it's a beautiful model. You'll see there's actually some horizontal lines going across the back of the cloak. And those horizontal lines there, they're kind of from the slip of the actual part it was printing. So perhaps I need to add more supports in future. But you can see that is a beautiful, well-detailed model. And I painted it in some really, really rich colours. And last but not least, we actually have the first miniature from One Page Rules that I printed and painted. And this queen I actually painted in the old school Games Workshop magenta ink. And that transition is created by mixing a bit of the current Druchii Violet in, which dulled the ink down a little bit. And you can of course see a small line of that delamination or mold slip as I was actually printing the part. But otherwise, fantastic looking model, and you wouldn't complain at all about having that on the tabletop, would you now? Even with that little horizontal line across the wing, I think the model is absolutely gorgeous. Right, so what we have here is we have the Hallett box, which is the printing box available to you if you buy a Hallett printer, or you can download it for free online from Creality. So since I'm using the Hallett box, this is the software that comes straight with the printer out of the box. I will use it, and I will do the most simple version of showing you guys the files that I can possibly do. That way you know what you can do out of the box, as opposed to picking up more complicated software or software with more options down the track that may create some difficulty. So I will now go over to the files, and I will simply look for one that I want to talk about. I might pick one of perhaps the King from the I guess you'll call them Khemri range, and it comes out looking something like this. So that is not going to print as it lays out right now, I can tell you that. Yes, you'll get where that red line is the perimeter of the miniature, and you'll get a sort of bed, but that's no good. So what I'll do is I'll go over to the rotate icon, and I would rotate this miniature up to around about 60 degrees. Doesn't have to be perfect, I could even just type it in here, 60 enter, and end up with that. So he is floating above the bed right now. I can then maybe go in and I could clone it. I could make, let's add 2. And it'll add them, and then I can just simply click them and drag them over into place if I wanted to. This is really great when you are doing squads. What you can do is you can clone when you have multiple of the same unit. You've already got it to the right angle and it's ready to print. Just clone it, slap a bunch extra down the build plate. Really easy way to do it. I could hollow the model out as well. I could drill it if I wanted to add magnets in a certain point. That's an option as well. I can also scale it. So I can have all of the different axes work together. I can shrink him down, or maybe I could blow him up to a giant Tomb King and actually paint him as something like a bust. That is an option that's available to you. You could even take these One Page Rules STLs and throw them into a file editor like Fusion, for example, and slice the miniature through the waist and actually turn it into a bust. That is an option that's available to you. So this guy's obviously too big right now for printing for the tabletop. So I'll shrink him back down to 100% size. And then I'll go in and add supports. So I found that the smaller support around the 0.5 to 0.6 works really well. And you'll see that the red areas that are lit up are the areas that are going to be exposed to the build plate. So the supports will come up to join with. Now keep in mind, the more supports you add, the more sturdy it's going to be, but the more of a pain in the ass it's going to be to clean up the miniature afterwards. And there is a trade-off because they will potentially damage the edge of things like the blade or the cloak. So those are the details you want to protect. Generally, since you want to protect the face of the miniature, that is the part that you will try most to avoid having parts attached to. Instead, I would try and have the back of the miniature facing the supports. So I can choose the diameter of the supports, but I think the smaller tip diameter works just fine, and the support diameter at 1.2 allows a pretty solid support. The support spacing doesn't need to be changed. So you can see the only thing I've really changed here is I've actually lent the model back, and I've slightly reduced that tip diameter from 0.8 to 0.6. Now I can generate my supports. And as you can see, that's all the points where it will grip the model to support it as it's being printed. Now, as an interesting note, why I might have gotten some of that mold slip heading across the miniature, well, you can see here, this part in the center of the screen is being held from above. Well, that's great for the ones above it. But this part below isn't actually supported by anything. So as it prints, nothing will be holding that up off the build plate. So what I will have to do is actually add a support in there. So I will come around and I will click on that tip. And now, when I edit finish, that support will generate. And you can see it's now added in along here. And now the tip of the cloak is supported. So that is something you may find yourself having to do if you create one of these miniatures for yourself. But as you can see, this is incredibly, immensely well detailed. There's actually texture to the cloth. There is all the little fine bits of bone and knuckle around the hand. Fantastic. Even the little winged scarab and the grips on the sword. Notice how they even go through the hand, which is something that Games Workshop has failed to do on some of their miniatures. Because really, that's the sort of thing you want to compare it to. And now that I'm happy with the miniature, I could go ahead and hit print. And I can slice the miniature. The slicing process will actually cut it down into layers, work out how long it's going to take to print. This is just done with the stock settings. And that is the printing process. So it will print layer by layer on that build plate. And there you go. That's sliced. I can now export it to local, to USB, to whatever it might be. I can even send it by wireless directly over to my printer. So that's how easy it is to take one of these one-page rules miniatures. So there you go, one-page rules. Fantastic miniatures, very easy to pull out the files, easy to put them into your printer, and fantastic to make at home. As you saw, the only problems with the quality really were on my end as the person who was doing the printing, not putting the supports in the correct places, missing some of those little points, caused some hiccups. That wasn't on them, that was on me. The only problem I had with all the miniatures of theirs that I printed was a single blade snapping in the center in both the 25mm scale and in the 28mm scale and the 35mm scale. Apart from that, I had absolutely no problems. The miniatures are absolutely gorgeous. As I said, there is a huge range available here, not just for science fiction, but also for fantasy. There are bases. They're themed bases as well. Like, you might be a Tomb Kings player for Warhammer Fantasy. You might come in here, you might look at this file and go, geez, I would love to print some of these Tomb Kings themed bases for either Age of Sigmar in the round, or you could even use those bases for 40k for the Thousand Suns, or for 30k for Horus Heresy Thousand Suns. There is a lot of options available to you with the basing. And again, I'm going to use Games Workshop as the prime example here, because as we know, they're the biggest miniatures company on the planet. And they're sort of the golden benchmark and the company we talk about most on this channel. So it makes for excellent comparisons. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other fantastic models. There are objective markers, which are used in many game systems. Maybe you just want to print something to paint. Something bizarre like this Demon of Lust here. Something that's just that little bit weird. Because, maybe you're like me. You spend so long painting power armor, for instance. You just get over it. You're sick of painting matte blue panels of Ultramarines or whatever it might be, and you want to break from it. Come over here. Come to one-page rules. Get something unique. And you could go and paint that as just a bit of an experiment. There's so much stuff to pick from here. Diverse array of stuff for different game systems. Flying stands, fantasy miniatures. There's all sorts of stuff available to you. Templates, tokens. I can't say more positive about it. They've been fantastic to deal with as well, and they've taken feedback on board, and they've been very patient with me, waiting for me to get the review out. I've re-recorded a section of dialogue just today, the day this video is actually going live. This section right now and one other, because I wasn't happy with the performance of them, and they didn't get on my back. They didn't say, we gave you these files, where's the review? No, they just sat on it. They've left me be, because they understand things like real life do get in the way, and I really appreciate that and dealing with people like that. So fantastic. Can't say anything more positive about one-page rules. I will, though, come back at a later stage and talk about the actual game system rules. People might find that interesting. Anyway, apart from that, I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all very much for watching this. Please go over, check out their stuff, and, throw a dime their way if you like. Let them know I sent you even. See you all next time.